Welcome to Addicted to Watches. Today, we have something a little bit special. We're going to be looking at not just one, but two vintage Swiss hand-wound watches. These two have a lot in common, but are also quite different. Both ooze character and offer something a little bit different. These are a Candino and Felicia vintage hand-wound watch. A lot of my videos begin with a question, so the one of this video is, which should we start with? Well, my favourite of the two is the Candino, so let's save that one for last. That leaves us with this Felicia to start with. Back when it was made, there were so many smaller Swiss brands making watches in the mid-range category. Felicia was one of them, but unfortunately, that makes it very hard to find out much information about them. There wasn't much I could find, other than that they were one of the many mid-range makers that outsourced their movements and died out during the quartz crisis. Brand aside, let's take a look at the watch and start with the dial. It's quite simple and no nonsense. Everything you need and nothing you don't. Printed above the pinion is the brand name in a cursive script. Below the pinion is 17 joules and Inca block, which is a technology for absorbing shock and protecting the movement inside the watch. Finally, below that, either side of the 6 o'clock marker is Swiss made. Around the dial are applied markers. These are just simple rectangle buttons, but they are quite tall and actually sit a little higher off the dial, creating a very pleasing effect of depth. At 3 o'clock is the date, which is not quickset, and is framed neatly with the applied border. The colour of the dial is a very nice off-white colour that has surprisingly little wear given it's over 50 years old. There is a mark just above the 8 o'clock marker and another just below Inca block. The colour has yellowed over time and in my opinion has the perfect amount of warmth. When we come to the hands, it's a bit different. They are nice enough and suit the watch. They also once had loom, which has long since degraded. My issue with the hands is that they are just too small for the dial and for the watch overall. I understand that because of the tall indices, the hour hand couldn't be too long, but it definitely could have been bigger than it is. I think it just comes down to the fact that they were outsourcing all their parts, and so got hands that were made to fit much smaller cases. Speaking of cases, this one is considerably larger than the Candino and other watches made at the time. The shape is also quite interesting too, deviating from the usual round shape. It's almost, but not quite, a TV shape, with a very flat top and bottom and slightly rounded sides. This shape makes it seem and wear a lot bigger than it otherwise might, and also means that it doesn't look nearly as small as the Candino does on my wrist. Taking our measurements, we have a case size of about 39mm at its largest point, which would probably have been oversized back then. This number does change though depending on where you take the measurement from. The lug width comes in at 19mm, which is fairly uncommon. The strap on the watch currently is actually 18mm, and it seems the person who had it before me did not bother to fit the correct size strap. Lug to lug is a very short 40mm, which means it wears pretty well on any size wrist. On top is an acrylic crystal that is heavily domed and provides some nice distortion when viewing from the sides. This brings the height of the watch up to 11mm, which is not too bad, but is taller than the average manual wind watch. From the side, we can see just how much the crystal adds to the height of the watch. We can also see the very short lug to lug in action. Case finishing is quite simple, with all surfaces highly polished. That may not be immediately obvious, as all of those scratches and marks on the case give it an almost brushed look. I definitely prefer it this way. The design of the case is a step up from your run-of-the-mill case, with multiple curving lines and angled surfaces to create some visual interest. The crown is slightly domed and polished, but the coin edge helps provide decent grip when winding the watch. We can see on the underside that there is a cutout to let you get to the crown more easily. It does not screw down, but the very plain caseback does. There is no mention of water resistance here, but like pretty much any vintage watch, it's best to assume it has none. Even though it's an 18mm strap, I really like the band on this one. It's very simple and so does not draw any attention away from the dial. It's also very soft and comfortable to wear, as we'll see now putting it on wrist. The size looks perfectly fine on my 7-inch wrist, and even though I wasn't too keen on it at first, the more I wear it, the more I come around to liking it. From square to round, let's move on to the Candino. The Candino brand is an interesting one. Founded in the 1950s, they have been around for a while, and have been making watches consistently during that time. In 2002, they were acquired by the Festina Group, who also happened to own Soprod, that manufactured the movement that's in my Trebus. Since being bought, they have focused more on quartz, mostly fashion-focused watches, but in the past, just like this one I have here, they made mechanical ones. This one in particular was made sometime in the 60s, making it around 60 years old. It certainly looks quite old with that patina on the dial, but the simplicity of it means it's still something you can wear today. Another giveaway of its age is the size being very small. And speaking of small, the small seconds complication is very much a vintage complication, and while currently underappreciated, I think with things like the new Aquaterra small seconds, it may be coming back in popularity. If we zoom in on the dial, we can see that patina in full force. Not everyone is a fan of patina on a watch, and even those that are will think that there's a very fine line between patina and damage. I'd like to think that this one treads that line pretty well. The off-white, cream dial of this watch brings a warmth that many modern ones don't or can't achieve. It's quite a simple dial, with basic stick indices except for the 4 cardinal points and the small seconds. The brand name and 17 jewels are printed above the pinion, and Inca block above the small seconds, keeping everything very clean and spacious. The branding of the watch is very unobtrusive, which can't be said for many watches made today. Looking at those numeral indices, they are very much in an Art Deco font, and that really suits the watch. They are very elongated, which makes them stand out from the other indices. I really like these, and they give the watch a lot of character. The hands are quite simple too, with needle ends. While they look like they should be loomed, it is either not luminescent material filling them, or, like the Felicia, it is so old that they won't glow at all, even after being exposed to very bright light. I'd say it's the latter. The colour looks aged to perfection, and a golden brown colour that many modern watches try to replicate, usually unsuccessfully. The small seconds hand is even more simple. It's literally just a thin, straight hand. No counterbalance, no loom, just enough of what you need to know that the watch is running. Zooming out and moving around the case, we've got an appropriately vintage case size of 34mm, which by today's standards would be a woman's size, but was the standard men's size at the time. A watch this small is very unlikely to have a lug-to-lug that you need to worry about, and it comes in at just 43mm. So of course, it will be a bit small on my 7-inch wrist, but for smaller wrists, I think it will work quite well. By using a manual wind movement, this watch is also quite thin. Even with the domed acrylic crystal, thickness comes in at 10mm, which lets it slip under a cuff easily. In keeping with the proportions of this watch, the lug width is just 18mm and feels right. Finishing on the case is high polish all around, which on some watches can look too flashy or too reflective, but with the size of this watch being so small, it doesn't really have that effect. The overall shape of the case, with its curved lugs, helps it to sit well on wrist, not that it really needed any extra help with that. Looking from the side of the case, we see the crown that is used to wind up the movement. It is actually quite a big crown considering the watch. it extends both above and below the case to let you get a good grip on it when winding and setting the time, and is domed rather than flat, which suits the watch nicely too. It is just a push-pull crown as you would expect, and together with the screw-on case back, provides a waterproof rating, which is likely not much more than 30 meters. For a watch of this style, I'd be avoiding any and all water when wearing it anyway though. The strap on this watch is just a simple, quite thin, black leather band with a subtle texture stamped. I think when it comes to a watch like this, simplicity is the best way to go. This particular one is the one that was already on the watch when I bought it, and is soft, flexible, and very comfortable to wear. It's tricky to do likes and dislikes with a vintage watch like this. When it comes to vintage, you just have to take it or leave it. The size is obviously small, but that comes with the territory. One thing that is up for debate, however, is the patina. There are many differing opinions on whether patina on a watch is a good thing or a bad thing, and even when it's a good thing, when is enough enough? Personally, I don't have too much of an issue with light patina, which I think is where this watch is. If you look closely at the dial, you'll clearly see how it has degraded over time, but just looking from arm's length, it has just enough to give it some character without something that looks broken. Now, let's get it on wrist and see how it wears. The small size means it fits very easily on my wrist. It's definitely a very understated look, and while some may think it looks too small, I really like the way it looks. It's light and comfortable, and easy to just forget you're wearing it at all. So, we've looked at two similar but different vintage manual wind Swiss watches. As mentioned at the beginning, the Candino is probably my favourite of the two, and I think that's mainly due to the unusual case shape of the Felicia. It's important to keep in mind when going vintage though, that finding replacement parts when it comes time to service can be hard, expensive, or both, and in most cases, will require a donor movement. Choosing something from a brand that manufactured high volume or used popular movements can negate some of this, but it's usually best to do some research before diving in. What do you think about these watches? Have you had any experience with vintage, good or bad? Which of these two do you prefer? Let me know in the comments, and I'll see you next time.